Thanks so much for having me. It really is an honor to be here with you all. The late poet, Mary Oliver, once asked a question that gets to the heart of what I want to talk about tonight when she asked, "What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" For the past 3.5 years, I've had the privilege, really, of sharing life with university students in Berkeley, California. And a lot of what I've been doing there has been trying to help students reflect more deeply on the topic of calling, providing time and space to ask more than just how do I land a job after college, but the bigger questions of life's purpose and direction. There are a number of authors who've been helpful for me personally on this topic. In fact, the one author I can still quote from my freshman year of college is the Quaker writer Parker Palmer, who wrote this lovely little book called Let Your Life Speak. And in this book, Palmer describes calling at its deepest level as this something I can't not do. He intentionally uses the double negative for emphasis. This something I can't not do for reasons I'm unable to explain to others and I don't even fully understand myself, but that are nonetheless compelling. And so take some time to let your life speak, he says. Reflect back on your life and ask, what are those things you've been compelled to do all the way through? I was in grad school when I was introduced to the writing of the Presbyterian minister and novelist Frederick Buechner, who has since become one of my all-time favorite writers. And Buechner writes on calling as well, and he describes calling as the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. In other words, that thing that you can't not do, where does that meet what the world is desperate for you to do? That's where you find calling, he says. Now, you all have heard a lot of stories tonight. And part of what I'm learning is that we learn about calling largely through hearing one another's stories. Stories don't only tell us what has been, they tell us what might be, what can be. Stories remind us that the way things are is not the way things have to be. You see, stories are not only descriptive, they're formative, and they have the power to transform our entire lives. I've long been interested in the kind of stories we tell when it comes to calling, and I'm especially interested in the role of failure in these stories and how failure affects our decisions. It's been said that the wise learn as much from failure as they do from success. But what I want to suggest tonight is that failure gives us the opportunity to learn even more. But when we leave failure out of our calling narratives, we're left with a too small understanding of what it means to be called. And one way to test this is to ask this question: if you knew you'd fail, would you still consider yourself called? Would you still go? I first became interested in how we talk about calling when my own story was turned on its head by a surprising sense of call. But the thing you must know before I share my story with you is that studying theology at Oxford represents the complete opposite of everything I ever wanted growing up. You see, I grew up in the far corner of the Pacific Northwest, so basically head to Washington State and don't stop until you see Canada, and only right before you hit Canada. I grew up in this small farm town where dairy cows outnumber people 10-1, and the lone blinking stoplight, the ones more of a luxury than a necessity. Maybe you've been to a town like that. I grew up as the oldest child in our single-parent household where times were often tough. I remember asking on one drive home from the grocery store how long we would have to use food stamps. And I remember the face that assured me I would never ask that question again. And so because of my childhood, I made two fairly ambitious goals for myself at a very young age, pacts with myself, really. The first is that my children would always have two parents at home, to watch movies on Friday night, to be there cheering them on at their ball games. And then secondly, that my children would never have to worry about where the money was going to come from, for groceries, for rent, or otherwise. And so because of these goals, had someone told me, say way back in high school, that I would leave a perfectly good career to return to school to study theology, I would have said they were crazy. And then I would have clarified what theology is. You see, these goals shaped everything I did in my entire life. They motivated me to work as hard as anyone I knew in high school, in college, and then later on, working long hours when I landed a job at a marketing and public relations firm, where I was tasked with helping my clients tell their story. But at 25, I made the kind of decision with my wife that neither one of us ever would have seen coming. It was the kind of decision that at times I had trouble really explaining to other people because I didn't fully understand it myself. But in the worst economy since the Great Depression, we liquidated our retirement accounts. We said goodbye to our coworkers, to our friends, to our family, and we moved some 5,000 miles to Oxford, England, so that I could study theology. It was my hope to follow in the footsteps of my literary hero, C.S. Lewis. I didn't grow up reading Lewis like a lot of Narnia fans I know. But when I finally made it to college, I was so struck by his writing. I was struck by the way that he combined imagination and reason in a way that encouraged me to take my faith more seriously. And I wanted to do the same for others. When we landed in Oxford, I found myself being asked the same question you're asked anytime you show up in a new place. So what brought you here? Lewis, I'd say, assuming my one-word response was sufficient. But time after time, the response would be the same, this look of confusion. And then finally, someone would speak up and say, what in the world does Alice in Wonderland have to do with theology? See, it turns out that Lewis Carroll, not C.S. Lewis, is the most well-known Lewis in Oxford. But eventually, we made a number of friends who were familiar with the Lewis I was talking about, who knew him personally even. Just a month after my wife and I arrived in Oxford, we were invited to the Kiln, C.S. Lewis's former home, where we had tea with this very kind gentleman, Walter Hooper, who used to be C.S. Lewis's secretary. So here we were, sitting in Lewis's old home, sharing firsthand memories over tea with Walter Hooper, who knew Lewis himself. A few months later, I was working in the library when I received a phone call. And so I darted out of the library so as not to interrupt anyone. I answered the phone, and it was Professor Debbie Higgins, who used to be the director of the kilns. And she told me that they were looking for some part-time help at the kilns. They were looking for a tour guide. And it was one of those conversations where you're just sort of like waiting for the hook. Like, you want me to talk about my favorite author from his former home, and you're going to pay me. And you want my first unborn child, or where do I sign? I'll be right there. I know the bus route. About a month later, I was asked to serve as president of the Oxford University C.S. Lewis Society. And then for our second year in Oxford, we were actually invited by the C.S. Lewis Foundation to move into the kilns as a scholar in residence. And friends, what you have to know is that all of this was simply beyond a dream come true for this small-town farm kid from Washington State. But our journey also involved the kind of closed doors that made me seriously doubt whether we had even been called at all. At the end of our first year in Oxford, thanks to a combination of unexpected expenses and this ungodly exchange rate, our bank account ran dry. In fact, the only reason we were able to pay our last month's rent is because a letter showed up in the mail from back home with a short note that read, "Thinking of you, hope this might help." The check just allowed us to cover rent. And so we flew back home to Washington State for the summer, not knowing how we were going to return for my second year to finish my degree. We also arrived in Oxford, assuming really, that this call would involve my writing. I'd been working on a writing project. I landed a literary agent during my first year in Oxford, and Walter Hooper, C.S. Lewis's former secretary, even blurbed my project. And so we began shipping this project out to publishers, and I began to feel like this giant door was opening to my writing. Like this is why we had been called to Oxford. But eventually we heard back from all those publishers, and in so many words they said, thank you, but no thank you. And so then I began to feel like, well, maybe we were called here for me to continue in academic work. And so I tried that path. But eventually the door closed on that option too. And so after investing everything in this journey, I soon felt like all the doors had closed. And I remember many nights during the season, lying in bed at night, looking up at the ceiling in the dark and wondering if this whole thing wasn't one big mistake. When I finished my degree in England, we moved back to the States, where we welcomed our first daughter into the world, a beautiful baby girl we named Emma. That's her right there. And then we moved once again, this time to Durham, North Carolina. Even more of a foreign country than England in many ways. After living in England for 2 years, I could not understand why perfect strangers at the market or at church would look me right in the eyes, would smile like they knew me, and say in this foreign tongue, "How y'all doing?" Just 3 weeks after Emma was born, I started at Duke University, never having stepped foot on campus before. And eventually we made some friends with people who spoke our same language. We found some of our favorite spots, and we began to settle in to life as a family of 3 in Durham. But it was there in Durham, North Carolina, where I soon found myself sitting in what I can only describe as my own personal worst nightmare. See, our daughter was born with hip dysplasia, which basically means that rather than being round, her hip joints were flat, and so her hips would freely move in and out. We quickly realized we would need some help with these medical bills as a young family in grad school. And so we found our way to the Durham Social Services offices one afternoon. My wife, Jen, was sitting beside me in the chair right here. Our daughter, Emma, was sitting in my lap, not yet 1 year old, staring back up at me with this apple-cheeked grin, when the voice from across the desk said, "Good news! You all qualify for food stamps." And while that may not sound like all that big of a deal, and I would never want to reduce food stamps to failure, because of my own experience, because of the goals I had set for myself in life, what I heard in this moment was, "Good news! You failed 50% of your goals." You see, this felt like the very reality I had spent my entire young life running from. But in a way that I struggle to properly explain, I was suddenly overwhelmed with a sense of peace and confidence that this is just where we were supposed to be. Rather than just break down into a pool of tears, as I would have guessed — I'm a big-time weeper, by the way — instead I found myself smiling back at our daughter, and then leaning over and kissing my wife on her forehead. The only person in the world who knew just how much this calling had cost us. If you had told me before we left that this is where our journey would take us, I never would have gone. But living into this decision, having had these experiences, I would not take it back. And that's a discovery I never could have imagined before we began this journey. At least part of the reason we so fear failure is because we have, all of us, been shaped by so many triumphalistic narratives that emphasize and venerate success while ignoring failure. But when calling is reduced to success stories, we lack the imagination to enter into the most important calls on our lives, because fear cripples our imagination. Of course, no one wants to step into a call that we assume will end in failure, right? But we have to take seriously what scientists have known for centuries. Learning happens through trials, and trials necessarily involve failure. The greatest creative discoveries of our life and the most substantial growth will come not from success, but through failure. I was recently grabbing coffee with my friend Susan back in Berkeley. Susan's one of the wisest people I know, so when she speaks, I'm taking notes usually. So we're grabbing coffee in 1951 Coffee Company, my favorite coffee shop. And we're talking about failure when she stares out the window at this row of flowers along the street. She turns to me and says, "Ryan, do you know how those stems grow?" "No," I say. "Well, they break. They break. They break. And then they grow. Each break allows the flower to grow taller." When we make decisions primarily to avoid failure, we risk the most important growth and the greatest creative discoveries of our life. But simply telling people not to be afraid will not help. That's insufficient. We need to flip the script on our calling narratives. What we need is powerful counter-narratives from those who have pursued a call, from those who have experienced what they would describe as failure, only to find out that failure isn't what they thought it would be. Rather than cutting failure out of our stories, we need to take failure more seriously. When we're facing a major life decision or a potential call, what we ought to do is do our best to imagine what would failure look like in this scenario. And then ask this: can I live with that? What good might come if I do? For myself, yes, but also for others. As my friend Susan put it to me, still staring out at these flowers, sometimes failure simply means cultivating the soil for those who come after us. One of the most powerful counter-narratives I know on the topic of calling comes from the story of the German theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a brilliant man who earned no less than 2 PhDs before his 25th birthday. Bonhoeffer had the opportunity to flee Germany at the beginning of World War II when things began to get dangerous. He had some friends at Union Seminary in New York, and they made a way for him to travel to New York. And so he arrived there, but he wasn't there for long before he was writing a note to his friend that read, "I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I'm not there to share the trials of this time with my people." And so he returned to Germany, and he was soon imprisoned for his participation in an assassination attempt on Hitler's life. He spent the next several years of his life behind bars, befriending fellow inmates as well as prison guards, spending much of his days in prayer, but also writing. His time in prison shaped his writing in such a way that made for some of the most powerful work of his career. But just 2 years after he arrived, and only days before Germany surrendered to the Allies, Bonhoeffer was executed. And so it would be easy to hear this tragic story and to call it failure. But that would be to miss something essential. You see, by responding to this call, Bonhoeffer's time in prison shaped his writing in such a way that it has changed lives around the world for decades and promises to do the same for years to come in a way that he never could have expected. You see what happens, friends, is that when we are honest about our own experience of calling, we help redefine our collective understanding of success and failure in a way that will contribute to the kind of creative discoveries we couldn't otherwise achieve. And when we're honest about our own experience of failure, we help cultivate the soil for those who come after us, encouraging others to step into the kind of stories that this world is desperate for us to tell. Thank you very much.